Right, it says recording, I can see that. And I think we're good to go then. Let me just share my screen. Good. Majid, can you see the slides? Yeah.
Yeah, it's all good.
Good. So let's go then. Again, hello everyone. Good evening. Good day if you're joining from some other time zone, and welcome to yet another Agile Lithuania meetup. This time we'll focus on Agile principle number 1, delighting the customer. And a particular topic will be about design sprints. But before we dig into that, and I'll pass you over to Majid, let me just provide some brief information about today. We have a short survey and Q&A on Menti. So menti.com, and there is a code here. If you forget it, don't worry about it. If you don't want to do it straight away, don't worry about it. I'll post information in the chat, in the Zoom chat, so you'll be able to do it throughout the meetup. So please, go to Menti, fill that survey. If you have any questions, feel free to raise them. Also, there will be others asking questions, so you can rate them, and based on the priority order, Majid will answer those towards the end of the meetup. A little bit more information. So with Agile Lithuania, we're doing one initiative. We're doing a research during which we were trying to evaluate the spread and adoption of Agile principles, practices, frameworks across Lithuania. So if you're interested, feel free to take the part in it. It should be a very interesting research, and we're interested in the insights. You can scan the QR code, or don't worry about that, and I'll post the link in the comment section where you can just go and fill the survey. Right. Also, I'd like to thank our partners, Agile Coach, Omniva, Baltic Amadeus, and Revolut, who are supporting our nonprofit organization. We're very thankful. Because of them, lots of good things can happen, including conferences, meetups, public sector activities, and generally spread of Agile knowledge and experience across our country. So that's the brief information, and now let me introduce you to Majid, a good friend of mine, a very experienced designer, actually award-winning designer, and the industry expert in the University of Toronto. So Majid has worked with many huge companies across US and Canada, has worked with high-performing teams and companies, and is really experienced in his subject. So we're really glad to be able to host Majid today, and feel free to ask any questions about him or design sprints, anything related to this topic throughout the meetup. So yeah, with no further ado, let me pass you to Majid. I'll stop sharing now.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dominikas. And just wanted to say Laba Diena. And then another phrase I learned was Achu uj obsilinka. I don't know if I'm butchering it, but thank you so much for taking the time in your day. I know, especially working from home and having, crazy kids around or all that's going on, and spending the time for the next hour to be with us to go through the content. So I'll just share my screen, and we can get rolling. Okay, can you see my screen? Yeah, awesome. Great. So we're going to talk about design sprints today. And before I jump into it, I know we're talking about kind of the principles. We want to connect it back to the Agile Manifesto and the first principle, which is really focusing on satisfying the customer through early and continuous delivery, providing value software. So if you think, what is this principle trying to do and how it's doing that, which is satisfying the customer, and how in doing that is early and continuous delivery. And that's where design sprint comes in. it's really focusing on those, on how to get to that point. I know there's a lot of different, we'll talk about how it's different than what we call the typical sprint within the agile world, and what is it trying to accomplish with that. So I want to, first start where I came across this. This was 2015. I was working at a company which they're the largest recreational software company in North America, which they provide software to cities and all sorts of crazy things for the past 30 years. So that time, for 2 weeks, we had our UX annual event, and we were also getting CSPO. The company was going through this whole agile transformation that time. And then what happened, an article came out from Google Ventures at that point, which kind of talked about design sprints. And we're like, what does that even mean? We're getting used to this whole sprint world and agile world and Scrum and whatnot, but what does design sprint mean and how's it different? So then we travel, we had another large design team in China, in Chengdu, and we're doing a 2-week kind of training and working with the teams, because we're like, part of my team at that point, we have 4 different time zones that we had to work together. So part of that, what we did, we broke it into a 2-day design sprint. The idea was for us to kind of get used to what it means and understand what it is and what's the differences, so that before we even start advocating and trying it out within our product teams, we want to get a grasp of does it provide any value and how's it different than what we do today. So using it also as an experimental ground, where we went through this whole like storyboarding user journey through the steps in the 2 days. So we truncated it from a 5-day typical design sprint to a 2-day design sprint. And I'll get to those steps further in the presentation. So that's great. Now you're telling yourself, okay, how did this even start? So there's these folks. Knapp is kind of the main leader. You'll see him when you ever put in design sprint, his book comes up with the other folks in it. He was part of the Google Ventures. And Google Ventures, if you don't know, it's kind of a venture arm of Google, which they work with a lot of startups. Now they've expanded to different ventures. They have ventures for AI companies and whatnot. So they started with design articles. Like anything else, you start writing about it, then you present it to a larger audience. And then if it has legs and people are really talking about it, you want to put a manual together, and you want to put stories that you've taken, and you want to put it in a succinct order, which then the book came out, the design sprint. And since then, there's been a lot of variations of it, and people have added to that. So going back to kind of like, okay, now what is it trying to do? So looking at satisfying the customer's needs through early and continuous delivery. So we really look at it as these 3 pillars, and this is taken from the design sprint kit, which is something that Google's taken on since Knapp has left that organization. So it's around collaborate, innovate, and accelerate. Again, a lot of frameworks are really pushing for the same thing. So if you start seeing, oh, well, isn't that something that we're doing in other sprints? Yes, you are. And these are different ways of you can approach it. That's really what we're trying to tell you, that with the collaborate, you're really bringing the whole team together at the first stage. And when you're innovating, you're putting your customer right at the center, and then you're converging and diverging and creating ideas. And you're really doing that much quicker than what you've done in the past, because you have everyone in the room, you have ideas created together, you have buy-ins that's being generated through the activities. That's what accelerates the process of it. So now let's get into the mechanics of what a 5-day design sprint. So typically a design sprint is set as 5 days, but we'll look at variations of that too. And the 5 days, it's the idea of a week. If our weeks were 12 days, it might have changed to something else, who knows? But because we work in this 5-day working constraint, and we're using that as a baseline of saying, you have a Monday and you have a Friday and you have a weekend. So what can we achieve in that 1 week when we're working together? So it goes through these steps that we'll get into at this part. But the really key part of this is planning. If you haven't planned properly, and in planning, you need to get the right people in the room when you're going through this step. You need to make sure what is a problem that you're trying to tackle, what is the area that you're trying to get to. You need to define who are the deciders and the facilitator in the room. Most likely, if you're really super curious, you're going to be the facilitator. And facilitating is a skill. It's not like you're born with it, or it's not one of those like, you know, this person's great at facilitating. They might be, but you can also grow that muscle. So and facilitation skills are something that you can use in all variations, not specific to design sprint. It could be used in all sorts of scenarios. And then, you know, allocating time and space. And right now we live in a point of time and space has a variety of meanings, but typically if let's say once, you know, the whole world opens up again and, you know, everything's safe, you would want to dedicate a specific space for it. And you can make makeshift spaces. So if you work in an open office and you need to create something, you can, you know, put a couple of whiteboards on wheels and create a space itself. And the idea of it is to be hyper focused and not be distracted with other people like pinging you on the shoulder or on your phone. So the Monday is really kind of the first part where we start with setting up the problem, redefining the problem, you know, mapping out the problem definition itself, and having experts. I'll go through a case study where we ask experts to be part of it. And when I mean experts, it could be people in your team, or it could be people that are not directly in your team, but might be in the organizations, or you might hire. So if you're getting a very specific area and you're creating a journey for it, if you create a journey as a siloed, and if you bring some folks who represent your customer base, it's a much better conversation. You don't need them for the whole week. You can just get them for those specific time. So I've worked in the healthcare space. I had physicians, from audiologists to rheumatologists, from patients with stage 2 cancer to be in the room. So you can have all sorts of people, and they're very willing and they're very excited. And that's actually great because it takes away our assumptions and makes it real. So when you have a patient telling you X, even if you have the executive in the room, they're going to listen. They're not going to, you know, you cannot object someone who's actually living it. So that's why it's super important to get it. And if you can, get the closest person in your organization. It's not end of the world. And targeting your sprint for it, choosing kind of the goal that you want to get to and the specific users you want to get to it. So Tuesday is when the fun part starts happening. So on Monday, you've gone through kind of your problem, you've gotten a little bit of the research up ahead, you've talked to people, you've started stating how might we, you know, tackle this or do this. And then Tuesday, now you're thinking of like, now, you know, who is it for? You have an idea, you've mapped out kind of the journey. Now you've set up some areas that you want to investigate. Now, how can you create it? The whole idea with storyboards, this is where storyboards become interesting. And storyboards are, think of comic books, right? Comic books are every screen and it's a story. The reason why it's meaningful, because we always design for screens and we forget context. When I'm utilizing your service, your product, or you're solving it, you have time, you have location, you have person, you have other things surrounding you that are really important, that are context. And a story takes you through a scenario. And it's an easy way to understand, like, what are you trying to do? What are you achieving and what happens? And it also allows you that your solution is not really super screen-based. It could be semi-screen-based, semi-hardware, semi-space. So you're not really putting yourself into the box. And sketching. There'll be some people who are like, oh, I'm a terrible sketcher. Sketching is really to get the meaning out there. I'm terrible at it. And my background's as an architect. So we just scribble. So it's okay. You don't need to be a Monet or something like that, or Picasso. So you're okay. Don't worry about that. It's really to get the meaning up ahead. And part of that, what you're doing is now you're presenting those ideas with the larger group, and you're going through this dot voting. I bet a lot of people have done dot voting. You might give, like, you know, the big boss, you know, a little bit more dots, kind of like, you know, stroke that, ego, but again, they're important. They're where it goes. So you want to make sure you've done that, and you choose the best kind of solutions that you want to then get into more fidelity of it. I mean, here we have storyboarding, but I like to, you can do it in both ways. This is taken directly from the design sprint book. So I haven't created any of these. It's really taken from that. And then Thursday, at this point, you're recruiting your base. Recruitment might take time. You might have easy access to your recruitment folks, but it might take a little bit more time. And that's okay. And I'll show you in the case study what I mean by that. And then once you get to this point, then what you're doing on Thursday is really fleshing out a little bit more detail. You need to create a meaningful prototype. And a prototype is basically a stimulus. So you're creating something to react towards. You're trying to you've created your testing goal. Part of this, we've set up the problem, we've agreed on the problem, we've agreed on the solution, we've fleshed out the solution, we've agreed on what the testing goal is. What do we want to learn from what we want to test? It's super important. It's easy to jump into the prototype and start solutioning because that's how we are. But it's really important to say, okay, now part of this, what do we want to learn and what do we need to learn that from a prototype? So you've defined that at this point. And then on Thursday, what you also do, you start creating a moderator's guide. A moderator's guide is basically a set of questions that you want to ask the participant who's going to be testing your prototype or whatever you've generated, that it's the same. So you want to make sure that, one, you're not leading them down a path, because it's super important, because you can say, it's really wording and you can test it. And that's where you do a dry run of saying, let me pull Dominicus of saying, hey, do you have like 15 minutes or 20 minutes? I want to go through this with you. And that's where you catch a lot of the problems. I always do 2 dry runs for myself, because the first one I do it, I catch my problems. And the second one I do it, I validate whether if they're gone or I can clean it up, because you don't want to have issues when you're testing with actual participants, because you're paying them. Either you're giving them gift cards or you're actually paying them good money, especially physicians. Those guys, yeah, they're expensive. And then on Friday, that's where you do your interviews. Again, you could have these. The idea is it's on a Friday, but you can have it broken down into a few days. But the idea is that you've kind of taken the full gamut of defining problems, prioritizing the problems, creating solutions, prioritizing the solutions, creating a prototype, prioritizing your testing goals, and testing and learning off of that. And then that kind of takes you up. This is great, especially when you're doing discovery, especially at the first part that everyone's like, I don't know. And, there's a lot of opinions. It's a highly opinionated point of time. It's a great point. And that's where I kind of utilize it. So in this case study, when you said we're presenting this, I had to take the logo out. Sorry, when you said you're recording this, I had to take the logo out. There was a logo here, you can see. In those 2 minutes, I was like, oh, I got to take this out. The idea, it's a huge healthcare company, and what they do, what happened in 2018 is, so it's a hearing aid company, and OTC basically means over the counter. Typically, they would sell to audiologists, which is ear doctors. And then the doctors would prescribe the hearing aid and they'll set it up on the patient's ear and all that. And now for patients who have like low, it's not severe, so it's not really like they're like fully deaf or whatnot. It's like some that I have a bit of hearing loss, if I use a hearing aid, it's good, but I don't want to pay like $8,000. I want to pay like $1,000 for it. So whenever you hear over the counter, basically means it's going to be much cheaper in the whole pharma or healthcare world. So it's a company that's always been, selling to doctors. They don't know how to sell to patients, and a patient experience is going to be completely different, because I'm going to buy the product off the shelf. I'm going to go home and I have to be able to know how to try it on, how to get through that. So what we did was, part of this was we went through this piece, and I wanted to use this piece because, theory sounds great, but, there are a lot of constraints within your organization and the people you're working with. So we're working as an agency partner, and what we did, we wanted to do a 3-day workshop. We wanted to get a mixed group of marketers, engineers, design, audiologists, and patients, because that helps us, one, understand how is it going to also impact the audiologists, because it was a concern for them of saying, are we going to negate them? Are they going to backlash against us selling this product? Or do they feel that we're kind of going against them and saying, okay, no, we don't need you anymore, thank you. We're going to go directly to the patient. So we wanted to make sure that happened. So on Monday, we do icebreakers. I don't know if it's a thing in Lithuania or whatnot. Okay, it is. Okay, great. So icebreakers, it's a way to like humanize it. It's saying like, what was your first concert, or like things like that. Like it's a way to kind of cool down the mood, and everyone's like in a suit or anything. It kind of like, oh, okay, oh, you love this band. So it kind of creates a connection and it eases up the room. And we wanted to review the findings. So they did a bit of research up ahead. We wanted to review the findings. We wanted to get a product demo because they had a product that we're demoing, and then do a problem statement and goal definition. And there's a technical how might we. After this session, you can definitely look into it. I'll send you there are a couple of resources that I'll note on this that you can look deeper into it. It's a technique of how you can approach things. And then Tuesday, we looked at our competition from Oticon to Resound to Signia, which are companies that are direct competitors. And then we wanted to see who are the other folks in the sound area that are in the consumer world that are kind of like Beats by Apple, I guess, by now. And they used to be Beats by Dre. Yeah, one of my favorite artists. But and then you had Bose. Kind of these are the leaders within the sound, and we wanted to understand how are they approaching it, because when you look at your competitors, you're like, okay, they're doing certain things good, and you can get a grasp of what needs to be there. But when you look at other folks outside, they kind of give you like, wow, like we gotta look at those guys when we're looking at how we're presenting our product, how we're packaging our product, how does that experience look like. So we did breakout groups. We wanted to do a mixed group of we had 4 agency people and we're 4 facilitators, kind of main facilitator and other folks in the breakout groups. We did a journey mapping exercise. Part of that, we did ideation sessions, which is like we created solutions, we were sketching, and we wrote down the solutions, we voted on them, and we created scenarios and storyboarding. And it was a great experience because a lot of the engineers were like, oh no, we're engineers, we don't sketch, we don't do that, and actually turned out really great. So it also helps the team to kind of break that mold and work closely together. And then we did a solution presentation where all the groups came together and we presented it to the whole, like all the breakout groups presented together. And on Wednesday we went a little bit prototyping development, and that's when kind of we agreed on our testing goals, and that's where we broke out and we did the prototype development. Because it wasn't as simple as getting patients recruited, we needed at least a week to do that, and it was done in 2 days. We used Zoom, InVision, and Google. At that time, we were using Zoom. We had Zoom rooms and InVision for displaying the prototype, and Google Docs for noting down our findings. And you normally do it in 2. You have someone moderating and someone behind the scenes taking notes. So whenever you're testing anything, make sure there's 2 of you. So it led us, it was important for us to focus on the packaging and the onboarding experience. It was really important to get that right in the first 3 weeks. So it helped now the team to understand where of the experience they really need to drive in to make this a successful piece. So we're at kind of the middle of the presentation and you're saying, okay, now this is great. No, actually that's a bit later. One of the things I wanted to also note is design sprints are not specifically, you're thinking like, if it's a web app or app, and that example, it was part packaging and part hardware and part app. So you can also use it in marketing campaigns. Whenever, if you're in an ad agency and you're thinking of, our client has this big problem, or we want to create a new campaign. How can we do that? You can put the user, your consumer at the center of it and use this model. And then product design, you can use voice design. So at this design sprint kit, they actually have like a 3-day design sprint for voice design that's created that you can grab there. And you can use it for VR projects too. So don't think it's limited to one piece. You can use it throughout. So 5 days. As you saw, my example is a little bit longer. So there's 3 days, there 1 day, there are X amount of days. So even the Bible was, there are different interpretations for the Bible. So don't think that if it's a 5-day design sprint, I need to do it in 5 days. If you can, to start with, to just get a feeling of it, do that. But then once you go on, you'll understand how you can mix and play. So it was started as an in-person, and now we live in this whole remote world model. A lot of companies have been living in remote worlds for a long time, but now a lot of companies had to do this. Part of that, the Design Sprint book, their website, they also have they just recently published like I think 2 weeks ago, a full page on like how to do it remotely, what tools are there, everything's there, and they have their opinions on it. So I think it's a really, really good resource of thinking, okay, now I'm doing this remote, how am I going to do it, and what are the tools that I'm going to utilize? So now it's a point that's what I was going to say that time, which I missed, is that you're great. You're like, okay, this is great information. I can see the value of it. But how am I going to sell it in my organization? How am I going to introduce this? Because that's great. Like you can get really excited and it's just you. There's that video of that person who's like dancing alone at the crowd and then might look like a crazy person. Then people keep getting added to them and then it becomes a movement. And that's kind of the idea with this, which is you first socialize it. You start seeing who's interested and you start pulling them in, and you can do a lighting design jam exercise, which is basically a problem definition and solution part, but done in 60 minutes. So it's kind of your appetizer, if you think about it. You're not doing a full, 8 to 10 or 12 course meal, but you're giving an appetizer of, oh yeah, I can see the value of this. And this might be something that my organization would like. And then, depending on your organization, you might have a huge problem that you've been trying to tackle and like, it's just not working the way you've done. So, I mean, that's the perfect place that everyone's like, you know what, let's throw this at it and see if we can get something from it. So that's also a great point to utilize it. Or you're an organization that says like, what we're doing is working for us. I mean, it's not amazing, but it's working for us. So you can start with a small piece and you don't need that huge group. So at first I would say start small or tackle big problems. Make sure you socialize it. There are a lot of decks out there. Again, there's 2 big resources that there's a lot of information that you can utilize to make the sell. It's been what, 5-6 years so far it's out there. So there's a lot of content. Well, what's important is for you to experiment, because as much as you experiment, what you're doing, you're highlighting you're better understanding the framework, you're better understanding how to talk with people, where to pause, where do folks need a little bit more time, how do you rush them, how do you manage the group. So it's really important you experiment. Again, facilitation skills. If you're a really good facilitator, it's going to be much faster for you. If you're not, as more you experiment, you'll get there and you'll get really good at it. So don't be afraid, just try it out. By trying it out, the goal is if it turns out good, amazing, like, wow, like that's the best part. But if it doesn't, hey, you expected. That's why it's called an experiment. An experiment is not a solution. So there's no right and wrong. You're learning from it. So there are 18 different design sprint tips. Few of them that I like, which is around like kind of the big 3, which is ask questions, write stuff down, and mind the clock. Again, these tips, as I mentioned, are facilitation skills, but are super important part of your design sprint. trust the recipe. Make sure, just be okay with it. Like at the beginning, it might seem a little bit awkward. It might seem like, why are we doing all these steps? Can I just jump to the solutioning part? Can I just, you'll hear a lot of that. Can we just like go here and you're like, no, let's spend a little bit more time here, or let's explore it a bit. We're gonna get there, but let's explore it. Get commitment in advance. So if you're not having people committed to it, it's really tough to get it through. So that's why part of the planning stage, it's really to get, and socializing. That's why a lighting design decision jam it's quick. It gives you an idea. It might be valuable. A lot of organizations, they call ideation brainstorming, which is basically get into a room and start shouting ideas at each other, which is, by this, it's really structuring that. You're really structuring your ideation process. Be energetic. The energy, they feed off of your energy. Already they don't feel comfortable going through it. So if you don't feel comfortable, you're the person, you're giving them good energy. Have that, be energetic, drink Red Bull, whatever you want to do, just do it. And then provide positive feedback. So while they're working through it, just, make sure that they feel good of what they're doing and they feel valued at the design sprint. So they're getting that they're actually providing value to the team members, and make sure that they push the team on something that matters. It could be like, oh, we can never do this, and there's a balance of saying, what can we do today, or what do we want to strive for, and finding that balance that you want to push the team towards and guide them towards there. And don't take yourself too seriously. So have fun with it. It's really, that's what you want to try to. It shouldn't be a painful process. If it's a painful process, then it's not good. So make sure that you're having fun with this piece. So a couple of resources, which is the Design Sprint Kit, is a great piece, because what it's done, it's really written it down very clearly. And once you look at it, you can see already the icons or collaborate. I've taken it from there. I don't like to rewrite content that other folks have written it really well. I don't want to, it also has a lot of different recipes, like a 3-day voice sprint, which is very interesting. And then the design sprint. So he has a lot of material here. You can see his name, Jake Knapp. There's the book. The book's really easy to read, and he uses like very different examples. And I think that could help. He has checklists. Everything's there for you. And then in terms of tools that you can utilize, there's Mural and there's Miro. Both of them have templates for design sprints ready. So you don't really need to create it. It's really getting comfortable how to utilize it, and then sharing that with the team. You can use user testing or user interviews for recruitment if you'd like, or if you have your own channels, go for it. You can use Zoom or Google Chat or whatnot, and to kind of get through that. So, well, this was a quick, thank you so much for listening to me. And yeah, I think we're open for Q&A.
That's great stuff. Thank you very much, Majid. That's a lot of good information, and I think everyone here appreciates everything you shared. Yes, let's go into Q&A. Before I jump onto a few questions we have on Menti, just a reminder to everyone, there's a link and how to go to Menti in the chat on Zoom. If you have any questions, just go there and ask. So I'll start with one question myself. You mentioned that if this activity is not fun, you're probably not doing something right. But have you had situations where you really got stuck? Because it's a sort of high focus and quite long activity, 3 to 5 days. There are situations when you kind of get really stuck and nothing creative is flowing from the audience, or everyone starts shouting or leaving room and banging doors. And have you had similar situations?
So I think it's not around like getting ideas. I think ideas come, and that's the great part of this exercise. I think it's making sure that you're giving enough breaks to people so they don't get tired. Normally what I do, we also have like a stretching time. We do breaks, 20-minute breaks here and there. And yeah, so making sure that they get a little bit of exercise, they're not in the room for the whole time. And depending on the audience, not everyone needs to be part of the whole thing all throughout. So if you need specific people to be there for kind of the first part of it, you can. But it's around noticing. So you're reading the room all the time. You're making sure is someone fidgeting or on their phone too much. If a lot of people are doing it, that's the point of, hey, take a 20-minute break. Take a break here. Here's some coffee. You want to make sure there's food, coffee, lunch prepared. All that has to be done during your planning point of it. So you want to make sure that that's there. But in terms of no ideas, not really, and I'm always surprised if folks that are not the designers come up with so many ideas, because now they have a voice that typically a lot of times they don't, and when you're giving them to sketch it, it's very interesting.
Cool, good. Thanks for the answer. Let's have a look at what we have on Menti. So there's one question. Can you elaborate on jobs to be done approach? What's that?
Yeah, so in the whole Scrum world, it comes from mostly, I think, the Scrum world, where we have user stories, and user stories are typically written as a X, or a user, customer, whoever, a odd actor. I want to do this thing, so then I can achieve X. And that's typically how you write a user story. Jobs to be done is a bit more different and the way that you write it is written differently. So to get that, it's more around, so it still has the user. It's think of it as more of an evolution of a user story, and a lot of companies have moved towards it. But again, it's not something that's highly needed. So the goal of it is, again, to make sure who is it you're doing it for. So it's not your opinion. What are you trying to achieve, and why is it important to achieve that? And they both kind of do the same thing. So if you're more comfortable writing it however you want to write it, but that's up to you.
Right. Okay. Another question is, what's the difference between design thinking and design sprint? Are they the same thing, or just?
Good question. Yeah, that was a good question, because so design thinking it's completely different. Design sprint is a methodology for a framework for getting you from what we have this problem and we want to figure it out, solve it, and whatnot. Design thinking is more around, it has a lot of the same things. So you'll hear prototyping or whatnot. It's really when the business schools looked at other schools of how are they, at design schools, how are they tackling problems? It really comes from Stanford, where an organization like IDEO, the main guys, Tom Kelly and David Kelly, two brothers, super smart guys that created the company IDEO, and they teach at the D School, which is Stanford's design school, and brought this whole idea of how do we bring the play activities as designers that we do into the business world, or how we tackle problems. And it's really that. So you'll see a lot of things going from that, but design thinking is more of a approach of, it's not a very specific framework. Design sprint is a very specific framework, like saying Agile and Scrum. Like Scrum is a very specific, Agile is aspirational. And design sprint has so many different meanings depending on which organization, who kind of talks about it. But really, it really came to help the business folks think about tackling the problems differently.
Right. So could you say that design sprint is more of a method that is under design thinking umbrella, that kind of shares the same values and principles?
Exactly. Yeah. Like you'll hear journey mapping and storyboarding and prototyping and testing both in both areas, but with With design sprint, it's very like you do this first and then you do that and you move on to the next one. But design thinking is, these are all the different design thinking tools. So if you go on IDEO, they have the design, I think it's called the design kit. They put it's open source, you can download it. It's also a great resource to look into. I might be pronouncing the name wrong, but definitely if you go to IDEO, which is ideo.com, they're kind of there's two big agencies that have been leading the world for human-centered design, which is IDEO and Frog Design, for the past like 30, 40 years. There are a lot newer agencies, but these guys are kind of the godfathers within the area.
Okay, good. We'll note that. Thanks. One more question. So, design sprints kind of have the high impact, highly ranked audience usually, because those decisions probably can shape the organization. Is it really possible to make this, to base decisions on dot voting? Is there a chance that you might miss out on some great opportunities, or might not actually raise or ideate on something that user really needs? So yeah, bit of a tricky question.
Yeah, I mean so design is never ending, right? Design is intentional. You're intentionally trying to solve a problem. That's design. That's what I say the difference between art. Art is about expressing. Design is very super intentional for solving problems. And what you're doing is, what it's helping is to get consensus. It's helping you to get consensus and go deeper and deeper, deeper into it. It doesn't mean what you came up in this design sprint is the holy grail. And I noted earlier on, even, the Bible has different interpretations, meaning the framework itself is up to kind of change, and also what your findings are. And when you dig deeper, you'll have more findings. And the idea is that you don't do it once and it's done. You're automatically doing a lot of these activities, and you might be doing some of the activities outside of the design sprint framework. You might be doing prototyping. You might not be doing testing, and you might say, hey, you know what? That testing activity we did really, really helped us. One, so we don't spend so much time going back and forth internally of saying, I think this is how they use it. I think that's how I'm going to use it. Versus saying, no, let's just test it and let's move away from our opinions or whatnot. So to answer your question is, definitely there'll be opportunities that you didn't look through, and that's reality. That's why we have jobs. It's about like every time you look at it, and if the problem still exists, means you haven't solved it. But if the solution is there and they're utilizing it, then it's great. But if you want to spend more time and you have that time, you have the time is the biggest problem in the tech world. It's you never have enough time. That's why we skim through a lot of the steps. And this is really what's allowing you is to get people focused and deciding really quick. Because it goes through the chain of ladder, right? The product teams create roadmaps and it goes through a ladder and then it goes back down. So this is getting everyone into the room, agreeing and moving on. And that's kind of the idea of it. So the answer is yes and yes. So just keep doing it.
Great. Thank you very much. So we're out of questions. There's nothing new on Menti. So is there any last words of recommendation or encouragement that you'd like to share with our audience, just to close things up?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, if you haven't had questions, it either means two things. Either you're like, I don't want to, I didn't care about this, or you're like, oh, that was a great talk. Now I need to do my homework. So I think after this, the part of this, really this talk is to intrigue curiosity. So it's about making sure if it's something that makes sense for you or whatnot, as simple, if you just Google design sprint, there'll be a lot of resources. There'll be a lot of good videos out there for you to kind of watch and just experiment, try it out. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? It might not turn out great, but what would happen is it might give you another tool in your arsenal and your toolbox that you can use for solving problems. And that's kind of goes back to design thinking, is to add more tools to your toolbox when you're trying to attack problems or and have different ways. So my background's in architecture. So I used to be an architect, and then I went into this whole route. When we're designing shapes, we do basic movements. So you flip it, you're like, this is a great building. What if we just turn it this way? And you're like, oh, I never thought about that. So what you're doing is with every of these tools, you're moving the problem around and you're looking at the more different perspectives, and then and get people's opinions on it. It doesn't matter. I always say, you can tear it up however you want, but you just need to have a good reason, and then we can work towards it. So yeah, just have fun with it, and I keep experimenting.
That's great advice, especially like that every new tool can add a different new perspective to the challenge that you're facing. So
yeah,
good tip. So thank you very much, Manjit, for joining us. I hope we haven't taken too much of your day.
no, this was great.
And yeah, thanks. Also, thank you everyone who stayed around and listened. In the Menti tool, you can also leave some feedback. So the last slide on Menti will allow you to to write some feedback if you have any to us as Agile Lithuania, to Majid, generally around this meetup or in general. So feel free to leave that. And with that being said, again, thanks everyone, and have a good rest of your evening.
Yeah,
or day
so
if
much.
It's in Canada.
Yeah.
Thanks, Majid. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.